This is the Domino Theory. I'm your host, Rick Doherty, joined today by Forrest Isaac Jones. Forrest, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited for this interview.
Rick, thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well, and I appreciate you having me on your program.
So, one of my major focuses has always been on the working class struggle, and not just the working class struggle as in class unity, but trying to tell people what you have in common with other working class people might be way more than you think. And your book is the prime example of that. You wrote the book Good Trouble: The Selma, Alabama and Derry, Northern Ireland Connection, 1963 to 1972, connecting the civil rights movement in the South in the United States with the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland. So, why don't you first talk about this as a broad topic, and then we're going to get into some specifics?
Sure. So, telling the story about how this book came about, I'm gonna back up a few years and then fast forward. So, when I was getting my master's degree at Hollins University back in oh gosh, 2007, somewhere around that time period, I was able to travel to Northern Ireland for the first time. And the reason I went over is because when I was doing my master's for history, I focused on Northern Ireland and the Troubles. Now, the reason I say that is because when I did my focus back then, when we were doing the research, we basically started in the late 70s and went all the way up to the Good Friday Peace Agreement in 1998. So that was my focus. I mean that is what I knew when it came to Northern Ireland. So I visited Northern Ireland, loved it, loved the people, great place. So I became a history teacher, or I was a history teacher at the time. I'm going to fast forward up to COVID, when COVID hit in 2020, because that's where the story turns. When COVID hit in 2020, of course, everything was shut down. We were spending a lot of time online. I was spending a lot of time on Twitter, honestly. And I'm a big reader, so I happened to learn about a book on Twitter called On Bloody Sunday. And if a lot of your viewers don't know about Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, it happened in January 1972. And in a nutshell, it was a protest march against internment by the Catholic population. A number of Catholic protesters were shot down and killed by British paratroopers. The book was written by a lady by the name of Julie Ann Campbell. And Julie Ann's connection to the book was that her uncle, Jackie Duddy, was the first person shot at Bloody Sunday on that date. And your viewers and you yourself may remember there is an iconic picture of Bloody Sunday where there is a young man being carried in the streets and there is a priest waving a white handkerchief. That person they're carrying is Jackie Duddy. That is Julianne's uncle. 17 years old, one of the youngest people that was killed at Bloody Sunday. I read the book. I was blown away. I'm a history nerd, so I loved it. I thought it was just a great capture of what happened that day. So, being on Twitter, had nothing else to do. I reached out to Julian. I said, "Hey, love the book. Would love to learn more about Northern Ireland, Bloody Sunday, et cetera, et cetera." So we started talking. Once COVID died down and we were able to travel again, we had become, I guess you would say, Twitter friends. And in 2021, she said, "Hey, I know you've been to Belfast. Have you ever been to Derry?" And I'd never been to Derry. And I said, "No, I would love to come." She said, "Hey, come on over. We can meet, hang out, all that good stuff." So when I went over there in 2021, she said, "I want you to take a tour of the city and just walk around." I walked around Derry and stood out like a sore thumb. It's not the most diverse of places. So people, I think, could hear my accent and could tell this guy's not from here. So when I walked around Derry, so many people came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, we took so much from your movement." And me being a history major, my master's focusing on the troubles, I didn't know what they were talking about. I said, "Well, what do you mean exactly?" They said, "Oh my gosh, the civil rights movement. We took so much from your civil rights movement. We used it as a template for our own civil rights movement." And that was my aha moment because I had never heard about this before. I was a history major. I did my master's on the troubles. I had never heard that there was such a connection between the two civil rights movements. So I went back to Julianne. I said, "Hey, do you know about this?" And she, of course, looked at me like I was crazy. She was, "Of course we do. How do you guys not know about this?" So I told her, I said, "Hey, my mom was actually at the March on Washington in 1963." And she said, "Oh my gosh, Forrest, you got to write a book about this. This is a book just sitting for you to write it because this has not been done before, or very few people have done it before." So that was the reason this book came about. If I had not read her book, if I had not met her, if I had not gone over there, none of this would have happened because I had no desire at that time to write a nonfiction historical book. So she actually wrote the introduction to the book. We've become very, very good friends, and that is how the book came about.
Awesome. What a great story. And I can actually tell you that my first visit to Derry, even though I didn't have any Twitter friends there, it was very, very similar because you go there and you can still see the scars
Mm-hmm.
of the civil rights movement, of the
Yes.
troubles. You can still
Yes.
see them there. And there are memorials, there are murals on the side of buildings.
Yes.
It is very, very omnipresent when you're there.
Mm-hmm.
But like you mentioned, the people are so welcoming, and you
Yes.
can see that even though they went through this incredibly hard thing, they're still so proud of their city. They're still
Mm-hmm.
so proud of everything they've accomplished, everything they've come through in the most recent decades. And I think that moving forward, that's a great sign because it's not perfect yet. The Good Friday Accord did not fix everything, but you can tell that they really want to move forward here. And when you connect what happened in Northern Ireland with what happened in the South in the United States, and both of those movements very much not being finished yet, we might be able to point to landmark things, the Good Friday Accord.
Mm-hmm.
We can point to the Civil Rights Act. A lot of those things did happen and were great, and they are still just stepping stones as we continue to try to move past some of these things. But when you're making that connection, what are you seeing when it comes to the everyday people and how these things were affecting them? Because we talk a lot about the politics, we talk a lot about the people in power, the people signing the accord, the people signing the Civil Rights Act, but we don't often talk about what life was like on the ground for the people really living it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm going to give you two examples. When I started writing a book, I knew that I needed to find people that were actually involved with the Selma movement and actually involved with the Derry movement. So, and I won't go into the whole search of people that were at Selma or Derry, but I will tell you that because of some connections, I started talking to a group of people from the Selma time period in the 60s called the Courageous Eight. And again, me being a history person, I had never heard of these people ever. And the Courageous Eight basically were, as it says, eight people who lived in Selma at the time. Like you mentioned, regular people. We're not talking like John Lewis, Martin Luther King, people like that. We're talking about teachers. We're talking about preachers. We're talking about people that were just everyday folks who were basically organizing behind the scenes on the ground at Selma. I was able to interview, unfortunately, the eight are passed away now, but I was able to interview their sons and daughters and relatives about what they did during that time. And the biggest thing that they did, and I never knew about this, and a lot of people are surprised when they hear about this, if it wasn't for them, Martin Luther King never would have gone to Selma. They were the ones that actually got Dr. King to come to Selma to do the march and to do everything that he did. It wasn't because King just pointed out, I'm going to Selma. They actually reached out to him. Incredible story. And again, like you said, just regular, ordinary people that were just doing, what they thought was right. One thing you mentioned was what were some of the repercussions of what they did because of people knowing what they were doing, people knew that they helped get King there. You saw a lot of them being ostracized by the white community, especially in Selma. A lot of them had to move out of Selma. A lot of them couldn't get a job in Selma. So for all the good that they did suffer in that way because some of them had to move away because of what they did. Now, talking to the relatives, they're still proud of what they did because they know if it wasn't for them, a lot of the stuff, positive things in Selma and nationwide wouldn't have happened. On to Derry, I was able to interview a gentleman by the name of Billy McVeigh. Billy was just an ordinary kid at the time in the late 60s, early 70s. He was a teenager. They call Billy, he still lives in Derry. They call him the most famous rioter in Derry, which is kind of humorous. But Billy has a great sense of humor. I was able to interview Billy, and Billy basically was at all the major protests. He was at the Battle of the Bogside. He was marching. He was throwing rocks. And Billy told me four very important things that even to this day I still remember about the Derry Civil Rights Movement. He said, we had a slogan, one man, one vote. He said, that's what we were fighting for, one man, one vote. And the reason I bring that up is because at the time in Derry, you could have a house of, let's say, a mother or father, and let's say they had all of their siblings who were over 18 living with them. So let's say they had 6 people living in the house, all over 18, all Catholic. How many votes should they get? They should get 6 votes. They only got 1 vote. And that was a deliberate, purposeful way of keeping the Catholics out of power. So when Billy said one man, one vote, that's what he meant. Hey, you have 6 people in that house, you should get 6 votes. That's the way it should be. They didn't have that. And I had never heard about that. I was shocked when I heard that only 1 vote could come out of a house no matter how many people that was in there that were over 18. The other thing he told me was they were fighting for 3 major things. And this is where the connections come together. They were fighting for voting rights, which of course we were here as well. They were fighting for housing. The housing was awful for the Catholics at the time. And again, we were fighting for the same thing here. And then the last thing was jobs. Same thing we were fighting for. If you had a Catholic last name, you were getting that job. You were lucky if you even got interviewed. So all those things, regular people like Billy McVeigh and other regular people who were out there protesting, fighting for what was right, they were fighting for the same things that we were here in the U.S. Unfortunately, because of what Billy did, and this is mentioned in the book, and I won't go into detail, but he was arrested many, many times. And in the book, he will talk about what happened during his arrest, and it's stuff that he still deals with today, unfortunately.
So I think one of the things that frustrates me is I can look at a lot of my fellow Irish Americans. They have an Irish background and their family came here maybe fleeing the potato famine, maybe
Mm-hmm.
came over here because of the troubles or
Yeah.
any of these other situations that had them leave for the hopes of a better life in the United States. And then they get over here and they can sort of use their skin color and they can make their way into I don't want to say proper society, but you understand what I mean there. And they turn their backs on people who have a lot in common with them. So, what do you feel through these stories you can teach specifically Irish Americans? Because I think that's really, really important. Good Trouble, the Selma, Alabama, and Derry, Northern Ireland connection. We're talking about the civil rights movement in the South being about not just Black people. This is about equality. This is about working people. Martin Luther King Jr., his I Have a Dream speech, that was for voting rights and for jobs, like you mentioned earlier. That was a big part of what they were asking for there. So, what can you say to people who have maybe tried to ingratiate themselves into a society that really is still very suspicious of them?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. Um, Three things I'll mention. I was able to interview one of the most famous civil rights leaders in Northern Ireland by the name of Eamon McCann. And Mr. McCann is in his 80s now. He is still protesting. He's still marching, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful leader for not just that country, but the world. One of the last things I asked him, I said, what do you want people to take away from what you did? And he told me, he said, one of the things he remembers when he went over to the United States, he went over with Bernadette Devlin, who was a major civil rights leader at the time as well. And when they visited Irish areas in the U.S., Boston, New York City, places like that, Mr. McCann and Miss Devlin were very vocal about why are the blacks being treated the way they're being treated over here. And they specifically mentioned the black population. They had people from the Irish population basically jump on them and say, what are you doing talking about that? You should not be talking about that. We don't want to hear that. They were so incensed that they ended their trip early and came and went back to Northern Ireland. And he told me, he said, Forrest, he said, the thing that disappointed me the most, he said, those Irish Americans forgot where they came from. They forgot how they were treated. They forgot how they were treated as second class citizens in their own country. And he said that is the one thing that disappointed him the most. Getting back to your question that dealt with that, one of the things that I really enjoy when I talk to groups about the book, especially here in the US, a lot of them, and a lot of them have Irish ancestry, have never heard about this before. And they were like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. This is so neat. This is so cool. And I try to end my presentation with, you all have to remember we have more in common than we have that divides us. And I think this is a great example of how even today, you've been to Derry, they are so proud that the black population helped them with their civil rights movement. And it's a connection that is extremely strong. And for me to be able to go around and talk about the book and explain how we have more in common than anything else, I hope that's the biggest thing people take from the book, is that we have more that binds us than divides us.
Absolutely. That's one of the main reasons that I wanted to have you on the show. And here's a very interesting story about Bernadette Devlin. And that is, she was given the key to New York City, and she refused to accept it on her own and instead had it given to the Black Panthers. So that
Yes.
just shows the respect that they have over in Ireland, or many at least in Ireland have, for the civil rights movement here in the United States. I think it is an amazing credit to her that she was able to refuse this and say, no, this needs to go somewhere else, and we need to
Mm-hmm.
highlight something else over here in the US. And there are a lot of connections. It's not just necessarily with Derry and Selma, but you can look at a lot of those pictures of Dr. Martin Luther King in those marches,
Mm-hmm.
and there are Catholic priests behind him. And you can look at when the Ku Klux Klan came back, the second incarnation, and they tried to hold a huge rally in South Bend, Indiana. The Irish Catholic students at Notre Dame basically fought them. Like they had literal fistfights in the streets between the students of Notre
Yeah.
Dame and the Ku Klux Klan.
Mm-hmm.
There is a statue of Frederick Douglass in Belfast, and Frederick Douglass got a lot of his inspiration from a visit to Ireland, and he saw
Mm-hmm.
the conditions the Irish were facing, and he made that connection
Mm-hmm.
to the black, then still enslaved
Yep.
population
Yep.
in the United States. Muhammad Ali, he went over to have a fight in Dublin at Croke Park in the
Yep.
70s. And he saw what was happening in Northern Ireland just a little bit after Bloody Sunday itself. And he
Mm-hmm.
talked about it. He made the correlations. And then later in his life, he found out he had Irish ancestry,
Yep.
and they treated him like a returning champion. There are so many connections between the Irish people and the black population of the
Mm-hmm.
southern United States. And this book is just so incredible in highlighting those. What are some things that you could then tell black people in the United States about where they might find surprising allies, where they might
Yeah.
be able to find common ground in
Yeah.
some of their fights?
It is so exciting again to do my book talks and presentations to various people. But going back to your question, many, I would say probably 95% of the black population that I talk to about the book have never heard about this. And they are stunned, but they are pleasantly stunned. And they are so proud, especially the older black Americans. They're proud. They're like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that they actually looked at the Selma March and did their own march based on the Selma March. My parents, who marched in the early 60s in North Carolina, they had no idea about this. They loved it. They absolutely loved it. And the other neat thing, you talked about Frederick Douglass, you talked about Dr. King, and I did not know about this, but John Lewis spent a lot of time in Derry and in Northern Ireland. There is an iconic picture of John Lewis and John Hume walking across the Peace Bridge in Derry.
Oh,
I
wow.
tell this, I tell this story about when John Lewis went right after the Peace Bridge was built. You know, he had his entourage of government people. He was supposed to get on the plane and come back home. He told his people, he said, "You guys go back. I'm staying in Derry for a few more days by myself." And people you talk to in Derry will tell you, yeah, John Lewis was just walking around, hanging out, and we loved him, and he was just enjoying it. Jesse Jackson spent a lot of time in Derry, and when he passed away this year, there was a huge outpouring by numerous government leaders about how Jesse Jackson played such a pivotal role in the Good Friday Accord agreement to, you know, because of his history of the civil rights movement. So all these people, black Americans specifically, who spent time in Derry and enjoyed Derry and enjoyed the people. When I'm able to tell those stories here, you know, a lot of black Americans, they had no idea. They had no clue that there was such a close connection between the two. And it's so neat to see that light bulb go off and like, oh my gosh, this is so cool.
Yeah, the Free Dairy Museum
Yes.
posted on the day that Jesse Jackson passed a ton of pictures
Yeah.
of Reverend Jackson in the museum
Yeah.
being taught about a lot of that history. And you just think, you know, especially with somebody like Jesse Jackson, I think they went back and painted him with the exact opposite brush that they used on Dr. King, where with Dr. King, they made it seem like he was not really focused on the civil rights movement, but he was more focused on, bringing everybody together, and they eliminate the anti-war stuff, and they eliminate some of the economic messages of Dr. King. With Jesse Jackson, I think they did almost the opposite, where they tried to make it seem like all he talked about was race, when it really wasn't. There are pictures here in my home city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, of him leading lily white groups of union representatives and union workers in a march. And, he was always there for different working class issues.
Yeah.
Agree with him, disagree with him,
Mhm.
whatever you want on those particular issues.
Mhm.
They definitely tried to make his presidential candidacy, but all of his political activism seem so focused on race. But he called his organization the Rainbow Push Coalition.
Yes.
He
Yes.
wanted all working class people to see themselves as a union and not as a divisive force. When you were in Derry, and I'm sure you noticed this because I had somebody, once again, proud of their home city, and he wanted to give me a tour. He just met me, but he wanted to give me a tour. And we're walking around the Derry walls,
Yeah.
and he points down at the Protestant neighborhood. I'm going to say the
Yeah.
Unionist neighborhood because I want to address
Mhm.
this in a little bit.
Mhm.
And on the sidewalk was painted red, white, and blue, red, white, and blue, just lines after lines, trying to show that this was a unionist neighborhood,
Yeah.
that Catholics, people who want Ireland to reunite, they are not welcome there, right? And it reminded me so much of the whites only water fountains and
Yeah.
drinking fountains in the South.
Yeah.
It was saying, you're not welcome here. And I actually took a bus from Dublin to Derry. So the first I ever saw of Northern Ireland, we went under a bridge, and on the other end, we were in a town in Northern Ireland. My cell phone beeped that I had entered a different country. And then all of a sudden, we pulled into this town, and there were Union Jacks, and it was the year that the Silver Jubilee or
Yeah.
whatever with the
Yeah.
Queen, and pictures of the Queen all over the place. It was the first time in my life I ever felt like, oh, I'm not welcome here, right? Like, that was the first time I, as a white American, ever thought, oh, this place does not want me here, right? And then as you get closer to Derry, the population numbers sort of shift a little bit, and I started to feel more welcome. But why don't you talk a little bit about those subtle symbols,
Yeah.
the drinking fountains, the different levels in the movie theaters, and then those paintings on the side of the sidewalk in Derry?
Sure. Sure. So, um, when my parents were marching back in the early 60s, they went to a place called Livingstone College, which is in Salisbury, North Carolina. And the two big things they were marching for, one was to be able to sit wherever they wanted to in the movie theater in downtown Salisbury, because back then the black population had to sit in the balcony and then everybody else could sit down below. And then they went into restaurants to eat lunch, they could not eat at the lunch counter. They had to order their food and take their food out or go to the back and order their food. So they were marching to have access to those places, equal access to those places. One of the things that struck me, very similar to what you saw, and you're talking about years after the Good Friday Agreement, is that things have gotten better. There's no doubt in Northern Ireland. People, I have a good friend that lives outside of Derry, and she always says, we just are shocked that people actually want to come to Derry now because it used to not be like that. You didn't go to Derry. Nobody went to Derry. So those things have changed on a very large scale. The thing that I tell people, and I was talking to people about this in June when I was in Belfast. I was at the Belfast Book Festival talking about the book, and they were asking me about, hey, what do you think about what's going on now? I said the one thing that really I think has to happen that I think really helped us in when we integrated over here. My parents both taught in integrated schools the first time they had ever integrated. And they both said that for those kids going to school together, playing sports together, playing together, learning together, that did more than anything else could have done for integration. And I was telling them in Northern Ireland, you still, I think the last time I checked, there are only 10% of the schools that are integrated. So you still have kids going to separate schools, basically. As you mentioned, you have kids living, for the most part, in separate neighborhoods, like in Derry. You have the Bogside, you have the Fountain for the Unionists, you have the Riverside, which is mixed but mostly Unionist. And then you look at Belfast, which is even worse because you have more peace walls that have been built since the Good Friday Agreement. You have the majority of the Unionist people living in East Belfast. You have the majority of the Catholic citizens living in West Belfast. You do have some mixed neighborhoods, but the thing I told them is that these kids need to go to school together. These kids need to learn together. They need to play together because, again, I compared it to integration here. That's where you're going to get people learning to coexist and learning to be together and live together. I think it's very difficult for them right now because you still have so much, as you mentioned, separate areas in a lot of these, and I'm talking about mainly Derry and Belfast. And as you mentioned, I remember taking the train for the first time in Northern Ireland, and I remember, the train would stop at certain cities. People ask me, well, how do you know if it's a, unionist, or how do you know if it's a Catholic? I said, all you got to do is look at the flags. I said, if you look at the flags in the city, I said, you'll know exactly where you're at. So again, getting back to what you were saying, I would love to see more, and they're trying in Northern Ireland to get more integrated schools. I think that's only going to benefit both populations.
And we only have a few minutes left here, and I have just absolutely loved this conversation thus far. But I want to address one thing that we did very subtly, but I want to bring it out into the forefront. We changed the conversation from Protestant and Catholic to Unionist, and you can say Republican, you can say reunification, nationalist, I guess would be another word, but a
Yep.
different sort of nationalist than we hear a lot of times in the news. I think it's very important to clarify those things because when some of these conflicts are viewed through the lens of religion, it makes it sound like they're intractable. Like, oh, these people will just never get along because they have differences in religion. But I know a ton of atheists, right? I mean, James Connolly, the famous, he came over to the United States and fought for unions, and he fought for the nationalist cause in Ireland, and he was a communist. For all intents and purposes, probably an atheist. They didn't care about that. They executed him just like they executed the other members of the Easter Rising, right? So this is not about religion. And when we talk about it being about religion, I think it makes it feel like there's no solution to it.
Yep. Yep.
Over the past few years, you will see more and more, especially since Brexit, you will see a lot more Protestant support for some sort of reunification or
Yeah.
for having better treatment for the quote unquote Catholic population. There are the bonfires and some of those very divisive things that you are now starting to see more and more Protestants say, no, this isn't right. So, why don't you just very briefly talk about how this isn't necessarily a religious conflict?
Mhm. I agree 100%. And when I talk about the book in these presentations, one of the things I try to make sure people remember is that great example, the march from Selma to Montgomery, you had a large number of people in that march that were not black, that were white, that were Protestant. And you had people in the Protestant community who were in support of the civil rights of Catholics in the late 60s, early 70s. So I want people to understand, like you said, this was not a religion thing. This was a power thing.
Right.
Why did people keep or want to keep the black population from voting? They did not want them in power. They did not want them in decision making positions. Why did they do the same thing to the Catholics? They did not want them in power. They were worried about power. I think, like you said, religion is an easy way to say, well, they're a Catholic, they're Protestant. You're talking about jobs, housing, voting. You're talking about power. You're talking about giving power to working class people. So even today, when you're looking at, you mentioned Brexit, you mentioned reunification, the thing that makes people fearful, again, is losing that power. Losing that
Right.
power, if you're a unionist, whatever, if you're worried about a united Ireland, you're worried about Northern Ireland breaking away from the UK, that's a power thing. That is a power thing. And I said the same thing in Belfast to the Northern Ireland groups, and they agree. I mean, it is a power thing more than anything else.
Right, because I can tell you one thing's for sure. When the black and tans were staring down members of the IRA, they weren't saying, "Oh, they believe man is saved by faith and works," but it's faith alone, right? Like that is not what they were fighting over in that
Mm,
conflict, and it's very important to remember that because we can find those common grounds and we can
definitely.
continue to move forward.
Definitely.
Forrest, I just absolutely have loved this conversation
Yeah.
so much. When I saw about your book, I thought this is a guy I have to get on and I have to get him on immediately. I'm heading back to Ireland next year and I am going to
Yep.
bring your book with me and I'm going to tell everybody about it when I am there. Forrest, thank you
Uh,
so much for joining us.
hey, thank you so much, Rick. I appreciate it. It has been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I can tell you from just the short couple of weeks it took me to organize this interview, you will never find a nicer person than Forrest Issac Jones. He wrote the book Good Trouble, the Selma, Alabama and Derry, Northern Ireland Connection, 1963 to 1972. Such an important work, especially in this time where we have politicians and people in power trying to divide us. Forrest wrote a book trying to bring us together, trying to tell different people groups that they have more in common than they might think. And that's one of the main topics we want to cover here on the Domino Theory. So do me a favor. Pick up the book Good Trouble, the Selma, Alabama and Derry, Northern Ireland Connection, 1963 to 1972, and support us here on the Domino Theory. Like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe. It really does help us. We are slowly growing this channel, but the more you do those little things, those free things, you click the like button. You already made it to the end of the video, so I know you liked it. The more you drop positive comments, thank Forrest for being on the show. Let us know your thoughts on trying to bring different groups of people together in a society that is trying to divide us. And then I cannot stress how important this is to the success of this channel. Click that subscribe button. I know it makes me uncomfortable to have to beg for it each and every video, but it's so important that I have to do it. So please do me a favor, subscribe to the Domino Theory YouTube channel and check out every video we post because all of that helps. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.